Test. Yep.
It's all good?
Yep. Let's start, I guess.
All right.
No one's ready? Or is it recording?
Good to go?
Cool.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to our talk. So this is Head in the Sand Defense, or a Stuxnet for Mainframes. Quick introductions.
We also appreciate you turning up, being 5 p.m. on a Saturday, about beer o'clock, and DA's talk is probably full to the wall, so we really appreciate it.
Yes. So I'm Cheryl Biswas from Toronto, Canada. I do threat intel. I love big picture thinking, encrypted on the Twitters, and yes, I do have a serious Twitter addiction.
I'm Haydn Johnson. I live in Toronto, Canada, but I hail originally from Australia, hence the accent, so I'll try to lay off it so that you guys can understand it. I've got my OSCP certificate, so I do a little bit of pen testing and offensive security. And my Twitter is really, really awesome. It's just at Haydn Johnson, so pretty easy to find.
Okay. So. Okay. You say SCADA, and we say mainframes. As we see it, information security is a proving ground for lessons unlearned that we failed to learn from those who come before us. And there are a lot of lessons out there we see, parallels between ICS SCADA and mainframes, and that's what we would like to share with you today. So,
You might want to drag this up. Next.
So, in the beginning, there were mainframes, and it was good. Then came SCADA, and that was good too. When a mummy mainframe loves a daddy mainframe, well, you know, that's where we're going. But then came the internet, and everything changed, not all at once. And maybe that was the problem. It happened when we weren't looking. And that really was the problem, because we weren't looking. And if evolutionary theory bears out, survival of the fittest does not bode well for SCADA. So what is SCADA and why do we care? Well, SCADA ICS are two separate, distinct things that the names get shared interchangeably. ICS are systems that are more closed and controlled. So we're thinking automation, factories, manufacturing, important stuff. But SCADA is the big stuff. It's the power grids, it's the oil pipelines. It's vast tracts of land that are being monitored and the input fed back in. And for both of these systems, the equipment is a little bit weird. So this is pretty much all of the stuff that runs our day-to-day lives. It's the stuff that we take for granted. So hydro, water, transportation, medical devices, gas and energy, nuclear power plants. And much of this stuff is proprietary. Proprietary means you can't use something else. Nobody else understands how this works. Does not play well with others. So we have SCADA gathering information from monitors across all over the field, thousands of them, real time, feeding it back into a central repository. These systems started out closed. They were never intended to interact. There was never supposed to be public access, nor were they ever supposed to be publicly accessible. God forbid by the Internet of Things, right? There are a lot of moving pieces, most of which are proprietary. does not play well with others. Which brings us to mainframes, right? That's what we think of with mainframes. But mainframes, blinky lights, lots of buttons, that's just an overpriced IDS system. That's not a mainframe. Contrary to popular opinion, mainframes are neither obsolete nor impenetrable. They're designed with security and stability in mind, and they handle our most valuable resources. They look after finances, government records, money. The bottom line is they handle the bottom line. You can just ask the guys at Swift about that. So yes, mainframes are not your grandma's mainframe. Big iron handles big data in a very big way. They're built to last. They are the definition of reliability, and they're ridiculously powerful. They process massive numbers of transactions at incredible speeds. Think Wall Street, right? So these systems are not allowed to have any downtime, which is why nobody touches the mainframe. So let's play a little matching game here. There are some pretty remarkable parallels between the two systems. Let's see just how they match up. Well, the culture, for sure. Keep to ourselves. We speak our own language. Don't ask, don't tell. A lack of pen testing and active defense, because why would you do such a thing? The perception that these systems are secure because they're different and they're air-gapped, right? So they're cut off, right? And they're built to last, because the equipment out there is 30 to 40 years old and it is expected to last that long. It is run to failure. If it's not broken, don't fix it. Don't patch it. Don't touch it. It's closed off. There's no sharing, limited disclosure. Show and tell does not happen here. Yeah. So we know that history repeats itself, and we don't really have to look far to see how this applies. Thanks to the BYOD and IoT culture, we really do fail to learn from the mistakes of others. And we now have a culture that embraces the concept of bringing your own shit into your organization. And that's because these are the buzzwords of today. Innovation, and disruption, yes. So, I see a SCADA. What have we learned? Well, nobody considered these security implications. Oops, I skipped a little bit, didn't I? Where is that? So we have all new attack vectors due to a lack of security being built in from the ground up. And we have all access control within the organizations. And that's compounded by Internet of Things, more devices that have holes. And the scary fact is we are just not getting the simple things right. So we have weak passwords, hard-coded passwords. We've got unencrypted hard drives. We've got all idiot access, and God forbid that we should patch. So, we've learned that failure to monitor is failure to secure. And if you just leave these systems alone, they degrade and they decay. And that anything that plugs in is an attack vector. So this was really interesting. Back in 2013, a fellow named Eric Byers asked another guy, Bob Radvanovsky, about Project Shine, something he was working on that would shine a light on just how many things were getting connected without asking first, by using everybody's favorite search engine, Shodan. So the project started around mid-2008. Anybody want to take a guess about how many devices they found daily? Anybody? Throw me out a number. Wild guess. Higher.
10,000.
Oh, just a little bit lower. Yeah, between 2,000 and 8,000 devices a day. Holy crap, hey? So by 2013, they were up to 1 million devices. And some of the more interesting things they found were giant dump trucks and crematoriums online. Yeah. But this isn't a new issue. James Arlen, you may know him, a Mercurial on Twitter, had this to say back at Black Hat in 2012 about connecting devices that shouldn't be connected in reference to SCADA ICS. Does this need to be connected? And what is the cost of convenience? And maybe most telling, that the greatest threats are humans, because oops happens. So think bigger. What would that look like on a mainframe? So how does oops happen? Well, it happens when you've got a default web interface and admin controls or privileges active on your SCADA devices. And these are rarely, if ever, disabled by the end users. And currently there are a lot of these devices sitting wide open on the internet, unsecured. So this isn't good for anybody, especially when it's controlling our critical infrastructures. So, oops. To reference, why aren't we seeing more of these attacks? Chris Sistrunk is an expert on SCADA, and he gave a talk last year at DEF CON about NSM, or Network System Monitoring. And if you are on the Twitters daily, you'll probably see some pleas to monitor these systems, because it is not happening. And as Chris is going to point out, the lack of systems monitoring is a huge problem within SCADA ICS. And if you're not looking for evil, how are you going to find it? He also goes on to highlight this point, that there's very little targeted attack data on ICS systems. But that doesn't mean that there aren't targeted attacks. We already know that the attackers are living within the networks. We have the recent case in point of the attack on the Ukrainian power grid. And now we've got Stux Redux, or Iron Gate. Does this sound familiar? It will if you live in the mainframe world, for sure, because IBM holds these vulnerabilities very near and dear to its heart. It does not reveal this stuff. And you don't know what you don't know.
Okay. So what are some SCADA attack vectors? Most likely, these three that we show you will not have heard of. First, let's go through some of them. They're common or uncommonly known. Yes, I use those words in the absolute wrong context. So this one is pretty cool and right at home for most of you in the USA. The CIA created Trojan that caused the Siberian gas pipeline to explode. Now, before we go too deep into it, it's not confirmed. It's rated as likely, though, according to the At the Abyss book, written by a senior US national security official. So their basis on truth and non-truth is a slippery slope. The story goes that the US allowed the USSR to steal pipeline software from a Canadian company in order to see what they would do. So they obviously stole the booby-trapped with the said Trojan, and this is in the Cold War days, so like 1982. The Trojan was to cause issues with the pipelines and just cause maliciousness and everything to go haywire. The explosion was not necessarily intent, but it did happen because the Trojan was increasing pressure, reducing it, and kept increasing it, and ultimately exploded. So this was extremely damaging, as the USSR were unable to tell which systems were infected and which were not. And this is just a typical real-life, maybe not real-life example of malware and Trojans being used in a SCADA attack. So this one here, Maruchishaya, is confirmed. It happened back home in Australia. So sewage was released into a river and coastal waters back in Queensland. The start of the story is that a 49-year-old used a stolen wireless radio and stolen SCADA controller and software to alter data around the sewage pumping stations. This caused malfunction, which caused a spill. The ironic part to this story is that the guy who did this was an engineer for the SCADA installation progress related to the spill. So here, the installation finished, and then he sought employment from the local council like twice or 3 times. They told him no, so he was like, I am going to wreck your shit. So stolen equipment and SCADA attack vector in Australia can lead, to attacks, which can also happen to mainframes. Now, another glorious attack vector is social engineering. We all love social engineering and know human element is the weakest. So in this story, multiple attackers conducted an advanced social engineering attack to gain access to the company network and then pivoted to the control system network. This resulted in an incident where a furnace could not be shut down in the regular way, and the furnace was in, quote, undefined condition, end quote, which resulted in a massive damage to the whole system. So I guess the furnace exploded or something like that. But social engineering is another example for SCADA, which could just as easily happen to mainframes. Now, air gaps. We all know air gaps are the be-all, end-all of security safeness. Cut them off from the internet, cut them off from the network, they're good. Secret air gapping. Computers are considered safe and are chosen unhackable. Well, air gaps have been jumped. And yes, it is very true. The technique to do this was originally designed for underwater communication using near ultrasonic frequency. So it's quite advanced and it actually works. Remote key logging is used for multiple hops, and SCADA is not safe to air gaps, and thus mainframes being very similar in networking would be the same.
But what it really comes down to, the best vector of them all is social engineering, because the human element will always be the wild card. And seriously, if it has code, it can be attacked. And there are attacks. Yes, Virginia, there are attacks for mainframes. It's air-gapped until it isn't. So mainframes are not vulnerable, right? Well, IBM and others would like you to think so. The attack data, the vulnerabilities, the CVEs, they're lacking in this area. So we know if there's nothing there, there's no problem, right? But you don't know what you don't know. And in a recent MIT review, Phil Young, who's an expert on mainframe security, or he's mainframe767 on Twitter, says he found about 400 mainframes online, yes, accessible, with a login screen for anybody to sign on. And if you don't think that other regular server exploits apply here, we're going to show you what Chad Rickensrud or Big Endian Smalls has been up to. Because yes, Virginia, you can pipe a shell script over a network to a ZOS. Okay.
Assumptions will be our undoing. So the fact is, the mainframe is more connected than segregated. And as much as a curse is a blessing, especially for systems that were designed to stay separate, where security was not built in. The fortress mentality around mainframes no longer applies. They aren't even an island. We're trying to keep the bad guys out, and they're already in. Just like your bank, just like your coffee shop, they're all in there. The problems are to know who is in the system, what they are doing, and what they are allowed to do. So despite the culture and adverse reactions to mainframes being hackable, there are Metasploit modules, and if it's in Metasploit, it must be real, because how long has it been hackable prior to someone actually going out and creating the Metasploit module? A couple of key researchers are in this field, Big Endian Smalls and 4chan. Phil, as mentioned before. Just going to go through some exploit research of theirs. So then we come to exploit research. we did not just want to claim that they are hackable, we wanted to look into these researchers who were researching mainframes, so it's Inception style. So we wanted to break it down into understandable chunks, and yes, this means looking at some assembly code, or at least my attempt at explaining assembly code. Before we get there is now Nmap for mainframes. So beginning as small, being the exploit researcher he is, he has many topics such as cryptography, exploit development, mainframe hacking, and other is listed on his website. He is attempting to help make mainframes secure. So mainframes can now be scanned with Nmap. This adds accessibility for all us that want to get into it and start pen testing. Beginning and Smalls had an issue with Nmap in that it couldn't scan mainframes. Of course it couldn't scan them, it's not the same as everything else. They are different and no one has ever worked with them to enable this feature. So Beginning and Smalls had to create custom scripts enabled to conduct port enumeration and scan mainframes. He eventually decided to contribute to Nmap with some scripts, and now everyone can scan mainframes. The reason he had to create custom scripts is because with a mainframe, its banner is in multiple requests back and forward for it to create its banner. So unlike an FTP banner where it's just sent and read and done, it had to be customized to build it up as the multiple requests happened. So there is obviously now shellcode for mainframes. Obviously mainframes use a different language, so we need to be able to translate that said language. The conversion between a mainframe and the hacker needs to go both ways. As such, two pipes are initially set up. I get this wrong. It converts from ASCII to EBCDIC, or the EBCDIC, penis or something? Yes. So it converts from ASCII to EBCDIC from the hacker to the mainframe, and then the second pipe converts back from EBCDIC to ASCII, or the mainframe back to the hacker with his laptop. These pipes are used to communicate between a parent and a child process. So this is how you can connect with Netcat. But after some basic Nmap for mainframes and bind shellcode for mainframes, let's dig into something even more technical. Now, I've been working on this quite a bit, but mainframes are similar to everything else in that they execute code in memory. So we can start with that. Code executes command by command, and different functions or procedures are executed and variables are stored in registers. This is all similar. What is slightly different is how a stack is created, or rather a dynamic storage area, which is created from a procedure call, which is just another name for a function. So my attempt to simplify some memory magic, I'm going to start with the function prologue. A stack has a function prologue and epilogue, which is just a fancy way of saying the stack creates a memory, allocates memory for a function to execute, and then cleans that memory up when the function has finished. So the stack is running, hits a function, jumps over, allocates memory. So in a nutshell, or to try to explain it simply, the stack allocates memory by taking the memory address that is directly after the function and pushes it on the stack. This acts as the location to jump back into the main after the function has finished. This is known as the saved frame pointer. The base pointer, the EBP register, points to this new saved frame pointer in the new stack, being the bottom address of the new stack. The address in the base pointer is moved into ESP, which points to the top of the stack, so that they're the same, which is here. So you have ESP and EBP from the main to here, and memory is not allocated yet. So now that the stack pointer and base pointer both point to the same address, that we need to subtract it to allocate memory. And this has created the stack for the function to run. So the stack's created, memory can run. To break it down, so once the function has finished all it needs to do, the stack is cleaned up by the stack pointer collapsing to the base pointer and returning back into the function. So ESP is added, and it jumps down to the bottom of the stack, and then they return back into main. This is different to mainframes. Allocation of memory is different. Instead of having a procedure epilogue and prologue like the stack, it actually has a dynamic storage area prologue. This is because the mainframe does not use its typical stack, and it's dynamic, so it's more relatable to the heap. The dynamic storage area saves a pointer to the original DSA, which is similar to the stack frame pointer jumping back, and the variables for the procedure to run are kept in the save area. It's just a technical explanation, or at least an attempt at me being technical, to help understand that the memory for mainframes are different to normal memory, and thus will require different ways to exploit it. So now we've understood how it just creates a dynamic storage area and some changes in memory. How does one theoretically exploit a mainframe? Well, we'll start with something we cannot do. You cannot exploit a string buffer overflow. This is because the compiler is aware of the string length at all times. The string is not copied 1 byte at a time with the normal stack. It can be done with one instruction and move the whole string in one instruction to the new location. This is called the MVC instruction, which takes the location, the length, and the source location. So it will only copy what it's expecting. So if it's expecting 5 bytes and you try to give 10 bytes, you'll only get 5 bytes. So string exploits are not possible. What can you do if you cannot exploit a string? One way is to use S0C1 exceptions. These exceptions happen when the CPU is decoding an instruction but cannot find the instruction it's expecting. So when this happens, the program has attempted to branch to a different area of memory containing data, not instructions. So similar to a buffer overflow in a stack, where it's executing your data instead of a memory location, or your A's in that. So, did I skip? This generally happens when addressing an array with an index larger than it was allocated with. So an index of 6 will overflow an array of 5. However, this does work with arrays. So overriding the array will write into the next level dynamic storage area. This happens because DSAs are stacked on top of each other, and the first program on a mainframe is typically DSA level 0. And the idea is to overflow the DSA above and write into that with the code we want. So that whenever another procedure jumps to the lower DSA, it executes that procedure and executes our code. So it's similar to a buffer overflow, but in arrays, not strings. But we cannot write into DSA 1 because the return pointer points to DSA level 0. So it's just going to return and not work. But we can use DSA 2 and levels that are higher with that. Another caveat is that writing to the address higher than the top of the array is writing into uninitialized variables. So if we used standard arrays and then we write into them, they're uninitialized. So when the code executes, it's just going to overwrite our variables. So the answer to this is globally declared arrays. They don't get overwritten, the memory's already there, and this is the way we write out of bounds of an array into the DSA above. So we cannot write into DSA level 1 because the returner points to DSA level 0. But we can write into DSA level 2 or higher. So in this example, the code has been written into DSA level 2, and when a higher DSA, such as level 3, calls DSA 1, it's going to continue into DSA level 2, executing our code. That's pretty cool. So what does that show us? That shows you how insecure the machine code is, because there's not much security control around it at the memory level. But it gets worse. Mainframes do not have advanced memory protection. So you do not need to use advanced memory exploits such as ROP, or return object programming, and choosing different little bits of library memory to execute the code you want. There is no depth, and or ASLR protection. But the good thing for us is that it's accessible to you. Mainframe hacking. It is. Let's dig into an FTP exploit from Big Endian Smalls. Exploit mainframe /FTP JCL creds. Big Endian Smalls has created many exploits for mainframes now, which use reverse shells and bind shells. The first Metasploit module he created was an FTP exploit. And for a mainframe exploit, you would not initially think of an FTP exploit. This is because you'd think mainframes really hard to hack. It must have some magic and wizardry in it. Nope, just an FTP exploit. Again, we do not learn from history, and the hackers go for the low-hanging fruit, which is exactly why he chose this FTP exploit. To explain it pretty simply is that the FTP exploit is set up like any Metasploit module. Its architecture is CMD, which means that according to the framework, it executes a command that you give it, or executes a command to give a shell. Now, its platform is obviously mainframe, so it uses the mainframe payloads. It requires credentials in order to upload a file, and Big Endian Smalls has enabled verbosity and FTP debugging in case the exploit doesn't work. The Metasploit works by checking the file, the banner that it receives, just like an FTP exploit, and if the banner is correct, it logs into the FTP application and uploads the shell. So it checks for the string successfully switched to JES mode, as in to upload the file. The file is uploaded as a job, a JLB, and executes. The FTP exploit has a tester payload, which simply returns 0. This is just simply to check if an exploit is actually possible before you delve into too much. If you're a researcher, you want to start with the simple things and make sure each step is working. A reverse shell can also be used. This again translates EBCDIC to ASCII, just like the Big Endian's blind shell code as we showed previously. So he has a few good payloads. Now, what's funny is that Big Endian Smalls created customized Metasploit payloads for mainframes. But now, somehow Metasploit has allowed it to use generic payloads. This means you can begin exploiting mainframes. And it's all in Metasploit. So if you're a script kiddie, you can go at it.
And that's the power of this community, that we have those people making it available, and we really need to grow in that area. So that brings us to our wild idea. What if there was a Stuxnet for mainframes? Because there sure as hell was a Stuxnet for SCADA ICS. And like all the great stories, it begins with, once upon a time, there was a USB drive. Now, as we know, people love to stick things into things that they don't belong, regardless. And so that sequestered network idea, yeah. Because once it's in the system, malware is going to spread. It's going to spread like that cold your kid brought home from the grade 2 class. And this is what we have to understand about APTs, ransomware, and the evolution of malware. So these are the lessons from Stuxnet. Have we learned them? Let's do a review. Okay, so Stuxnet is a fantastic tale of rootkits, infected USB drives, and obfuscation at a mass level targeting an ICS SCADA system. It was a masterful breakdown of trust. Trusted certificates that we held as absolute and valid. But this was the attack that advanced the game farther than anybody ever thought possible. Stuxnet's filled with sophistication. We've got worms. We have air gap security being bypassed. We've got advanced persistent malware that can phone home. It can evade detection. It can erase its tracks. And it only uploads when it identifies the right time and place. So we've got huge learning in here about our perception of defenses regarding air gaps, and isolated sequestered systems. Here's what's key. Stuxnet was so complex, it wasn't just a virus, and it's not cybercrime. It's too sophisticated. It was rooted, quite literally, in a far bigger purpose, at the nation-state level. So yes, the threat is real. In December 2015, the Ukrainian power grid was attacked. And that was a huge wake-up call. It showed us the inherent vulnerability of these systems, and that yes, they are definitely targeted and will be attacked. In this case, it was Russia. But there's a lot more talk about cyber attack being part of the new hybrid warfare. And the US government is taking this very seriously and looking specifically at defending the power grid. Then in March this year, we had the first case of ransomware attacking a power grid on US soil. In Michigan, the Lansing Board of Power and Light was hit. Now, while Power maintained, their other services were affected. Again, this is a huge wake-up call.
Must be DA's talk.
I'd like to say that ransomware and SCADA are two words that should never be used in the same sentence. So now in June, we've got the discovery of customized malware against ICS SCADA systems, specifically ICS, and that's IronGate. While it was discovered in a testing phase, we all know that test moves to production pretty quickly. And for me, that's a wake-up call that we can't afford to hit the snooze button on. So what if we do a little crystal ball gazing? We know there's a lot of political volatility out there, and there is no shortage of bad actors and radicals. So let's surmise that certain first world countries, like the United States, rely the most on mainframes, and that they would make a likely and best target. Because if you go after the mainframes, you go after the money. So let's think 2008 and the global economic crisis that we're still recovering from. It was devastating, and it really wasn't all play. There will always be disgruntled employees, and there will always be disgruntled role players with radical agendas that need new and improved ways to create political instability. So how do you create the equivalent of an EMP without having to resort to one? Well, call me crazy, but the recent bank heists involving the Swift messaging service are like flashing orange warning beacons. And I'll give you the key points. All right, well, first of all, we've got attackers in the system, persistent and undetected. They move laterally to find the processes, credentials, and God knows what else to do what they need to do next. Is this sounding familiar, like a broken record? Yeah. So they construct a very sophisticated attack that lets them gain the control they need to access Swift, a secure and segregated messenger service. Like ICS and SCADA were secure and segregated. Like mainframes are secure and segregated. Right now, a lot of factors are pointing to a particular organized crime group, the Lazarus Group, as being responsible. I will say that, from my vantage point anyway, organized crime groups have a lot of freedom to maneuver. They set their own agendas. They're volatile and unpredictable. And there's something that we have to be careful of because they can choose to partner up with a nation state. And this goes up a whole new level because then it's no longer just about the billions. It's all about control. So cyber warfare is a thing, and we've got the proof of the damage that can result. Our systems are similar to what existed in Iran at the time of Stuxnet, and also into the Ukraine. These were not terribly run-down systems. We've got the same core problems of insecurity. And there are enough sources, countries, players out there vying for control or influence, or just who wish to reset the current political balance of power globally. Our crystal ball can't tell us who is going to make the next move. All we know is that there will be one. And here's my worst case scenario. Ransomware on the mainframe. Not your garden variety, but the stuff we've been watching trend very carefully since the beginning of this year and a little bit beyond that. If you remember the ransomware attacks that were going on in the hospitals, on the servers, the attackers didn't need humans. They didn't need phishing emails to get in. They got those servers themselves. And if you remember hearing about Java serialization, because it's a thing. So serialization is how programming languages transfer complex data structures across the network and between computers. And then disassembly is this process of breaking the object down into a sequence of bits. Well, the problem is that many applications don't validate or check untrusted input. And you need to be, well, we like to go with trust nothing, right? Unfortunately, our systems haven't been programmed to do the same. So before deserialization, the stuff gets in and it's not verified or checked. So we're putting Humpty Dumpty back together again at the perfect point when you can also add the bad stuff. JBoss A7 runs on ZOS. And this stuff has infected that whole layer of middleware. And middleware is on the mainframes. There are untold thousands of unpatched systems out there running older versions of JBoss. And these are vulnerable. And they are everywhere. It's not just the hospitals. It's all over. It's in the critical infrastructure. So there are remotely executable exploits against some major middleware products. Some of those are WebSphere, WebLogic, and Jenkins.
And there's a few Metasploit modules for them.
So welcome to the ransomware of the future. And at the rate that things have been evolving, the future is now. As described by our friend at DA667 and some of the bright minds at Talos, this is what we fear the most. So we're talking self-propagating ransomware that can move laterally through the systems to help itself to whatever it needs, like the attackers did in the Ukraine, and like the Lazarus group has just done. Only ransomware doesn't take, it destroys. So we've got the centrifuges being destroyed by Stuxnet in Iran. We've got the power grid in the Ukraine actually breaking physical connections as it was shut down. Imagine the impact on a mainframe when all of the processes lock up and it tips over and it comes to a dead stop. Well, you can bet that somebody out there is already thinking about this. And again, it won't be about the money. It is all about the control. So yes, you can hack the Gibson. And yes, you can jump an air gap. And yes, if it happened once, it sure as heck is going to happen again. So it's time for us to get our heads out of the sands and get our asses in gear. So we're here to say that history does not need to repeat itself again, not when we know how dire the consequences could be. SCADA has given us the lessons that we need to learn and now apply to mainframe security. Question is, will we do it?
So thank you everyone for listening. If our discussion on mainframes has intrigued you or made you worry, that's good. I just wanted to put some links if you want to get your feet wet. So some researchers to research is bigendiansmalls.com, extremely hard. Mainframe767.tumblr.com, and there's a great PDF on mainframe assembly if you want to dig really down into the lower levels on binary. Just ignore the locally HTTP. And then I asked those guys how you can get wet, and beginning as small as said, buy one legally from IBM if you have thousands, tens of thousands, maybe not good for a student. But Fortran listed some URLs that have virtualization software. Now that's great, but you've got to understand that it doesn't have the exact same hardware as an IBM mainframe will have, but it's a good starting point. So if you guys want to look, the URLs are there, and we will post the slides. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay.
So, I've listened to Beginning and sort of Fortran and a few things on Patrick's show.
Back home.
Elsewhere. And it's been often asked around, and I don't know if you guys have come across it or not, is there a security testing methodology for tests? We found a good way to safely test them and prove out to our leadership that it's okay to test these big iron systems that are running the core parts of an enterprise.
There are procedures that they can follow within a very constrained. So they have hit the wall on trying to expand past that point for exactly those reasons. There are people, there's manufacturers of the software, some of them are opening up more and listening to them. But at the moment, they're meeting a lot of resistance.
So some of the challenges we run into. So I'm trying to go in and at least take some of the programs that have been written in the past 20 years through our organization, and run them through some just first generation code review and app scan kind of stuff, and then also try to look at the system and test out the rack app systems and see what are truly
Yeah, they're finding that, I spoke with Chad very recently, and I was also at SHMU, and we tried to speak at length about it, because trying to get some serious, having the bug hunting framework around it would be really excellent. But until we can get the culture to change and the decision makers to come on board, and it really is, it's twofold. It's the fear of tipping the thing over, but it's also the, why do we ever need to do this?
Right, why would we ever do that?
Yeah.
Other than that, I think the P-test framework for everything but the mainframe. Until they can do that. So I think Tony on Twitter was saying that they have, at least the power plants, a SCADA have like 5 years for change management. It's like, wow, okay. We'll be on the moon by then.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, guys.